As with all dynasties, the PRR eventually fell. It became another victim to advancements in travel technology. While it was the solution to old methods in the early 1850s, it became what it replaced just over 100 years later. More and more started to turn towards the efficiency of automobile and plane travel, leaving the once bustling ticket windows and area train stations to eventually fall silent. While train travel certainly hasn't faded completely, one can only wonder what it would have been like to stand among the hustle and bustle of people waiting to board the train to take them to the next destination in their busy lives.
The irony is that the war effort helped save the railroads and prolonged what was going to happen. And it really was two things that caused that. First, the federal government, when the war started, they really controlled everything. They started gas rationing, which helped increase the passenger traffic. But at the same time, they told the railroads you can't build any diesel engines. So those materials were needed for the war effort. So the railroads relied entirely on their steam operations. So for the Pennsylvania Railroad, when the war was over, instead of converting to diesel, they said, look, this worked during World War II. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. We have the largest facilities to build locomotives and railroad cars in Altoona. We'll just keep that operating the way it is.
So diesel motive power was coming about in the 1930s at a very primitive stance. It was being developed more or less to replace steam locomotives in urban areas to cut down on the soot and smoke. And through that innovation, they discovered, well, it required less maintenance. It was less, manpower to operate, and the parts were relatively inexpensive to replace as components would wear out. So as the technology improved, other locomotive builders adapted. Those shops changed and evolved with the technologies, and the railroad determined it was cheaper for them to purchase from outside builders than to change the tooling in the shops here in Altoona. However, it was determined that the shops here in Altoona could be adapted into being maintenance and overhaul facilities.
You see the airline industry taking off. You have the interstates being constructed.
General Eisenhower, when he's in Germany, is really envious of their Autobahn system, their massive highway system that allows them to move goods and supplies and men very quickly. When he's president, he decides the United States needs that. So in the 1950s, he authorizes the interstate highway system, and that leads to a further demise of the railroads.
So now people are starting to step away from riding trains to purchasing and driving a vehicle, to flying an airplane from, let's say, New York City to Chicago, which is much faster than taking the train. And then freight, while freight would have still been its biggest source of money making for the railroad, you see the trucking industry start slowly taking over. So now goods being transported, let's say from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, don't really need to go by rail anymore. They can go by truck. And then with that, you start seeing the decline in railroads. You start seeing bankruptcies, railroads start going under. That's what would happen with Penn Central. They declared bankruptcy. When out of that became Amtrak, the primary passenger mover for the United States. And of course you have Conrail in 1976 taking over the freight. And now with the Horseshoe Curve, you see a massive decrease in rail traffic that went from seeing hundreds of trains a day, both freight and passenger, or a combination of both. You see maybe a dozen or so trains go around on a good day. So the Horseshoe Curve, and here in Altoona, is still vital to the railroad industry. It's still a good place to catch a train, bring your kids to hear a train horn, but it's definitely seen a decrease in rail traffic and its rail supremacy, as you can say. So as a non-native to Altoona, when I came here, I realized the importance that the railroad industry played in making Altoona what it is as a railroad city. You have the creation of the Railroaders Memorial Museum. We preserve and keep the story of the railroaders who would have built and worked for the railroad industry here in central Pennsylvania. and then you still see the hustle and bustle of the Norfolk Southern shops. While yes, it's not as grand as it was 100 years ago, the fact that Norfolk Southern still uses it as a repair facility, as a paint shop, that would have been done here by the Pennsylvania Railroad as well. And they're still using Pennsylvania Railroad tracks that would have been laid down. And while we don't hear the steam whistles anymore, what you hear are the diesel horns of a more modern railroad. So the Pennsylvania Railroad is still very much here in Altoona, and hopefully we can preserve that. We can keep the storytelling of our ancestors, of our railroaders who came here before us to construct the shops that are still here. During our height of our tourist season during the summer, we see thousands of visitors here to the Railroaders Memorial Museum, but we see tens of thousands visiting the Horseshoe Curve. And I think you can contribute most of that to the large workforce of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad expanded all the way out to Missouri. So now you have Pennsylvania Railroad fans out there in Missouri, and they would have known about the Horseshoe Curve. Maybe their great-grandfather or their grandfather rode around the Horseshoe Curve. And so we get people all across the United States, and as well as some international travelers, mostly from Europe, that either hear about the Horseshoe Curve or, again, they know it from their own family history. And so now you have an international base of visitations coming to the Horseshoe Curve.